It was the 27th of October, 2021, a Wednesday. In a small register office in Brighouse, West Yorkshire, a 52-year-old woman signed her name on a marriage certificate and became a wife. Photographs taken that afternoon show her smiling. Her new husband stands beside her. They look, to anyone passing by, like an ordinary couple on one of the happiest days of their lives. Later that evening, the two of them walked into the Prince Albert pub in Brighouse for their wedding reception. CCTV cameras recorded them arriving together. Dawn Walker was laughing. She was surrounded by people who loved her. That is the last footage that exists of her alive. By the following morning, her body was in a kitchen cupboard inside their home on Shirley Grove, Lightcliffe. Her husband was standing in the street, telling a neighbour she had gone to bed with a headache from the night before. 4 days later, he reported her missing to police. 5 days after the wedding, he was helping her daughter search for her, going into shops, calling round hospitals, walking through a cemetery. At one point, he told the man walking beside him that he was glad he had company, because otherwise people might think he had murdered his new bride. He had. This is the story of Thomas Nutt and Dawn Walker. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day, I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to West Yorkshire. Dawn Walker was 52 years old. She was a mother of 3 and a grandmother, and by all accounts, someone who brought energy into whatever room she walked into. Neighbours on Shirley Grove described her as chirpy and warm. She was the kind of person who would stop and talk, who laughed easily, and who was known to the people around her as someone full of life. Friends spoke of a woman who was sociable and caring, someone who loved her children and her grandchildren, and who, despite a difficult few years, remained the kind of presence that people were genuinely glad to know. She had not had an easy road. Her relationship with Thomas Nutt had brought turbulence into her life long before the events of October 2021. But those who knew her spoke, first and foremost, about the woman herself, not the relationship, about her laugh, about the way she looked after the people she loved, about the fact that she was a grandmother who still had so much of her life in front of her. Her daughter, Kiera Lee Guest, would later describe her mother to the court in terms that were simple and direct. She spoke of a woman who had people who loved her, a family who wanted her around, children and grandchildren who needed her. Dawn also had a sister, Lisa Walker, who would go on to speak publicly after the trial, with a clarity and dignity that said everything about the family Dawn had come from. Lisa described how Nutt had spent years maneuvering Dawn away from the people who cared about her, and how, by the time the relationship reached its end, that isolation had become nearly total. Dawn Walker was a grandmother with a family who loved her, living on a quiet street in a West Yorkshire village. She deserved a long life, and she did not get one. Thomas Nutt was 46 years old at the time of the murder. He worked as a scrap merchant and lived at the house on Shirley Grove, Lightcliffe, which he shared with Dawn. To casual acquaintances, he may have appeared unremarkable. To those who knew him closely, the picture was very different. The court heard that Nutt's history of controlling behavior stretched back over a decade to a relationship that began in 2005 with a woman named Kimberly Alcock. The two had met at a travelling fairground in Retford, Nottinghamshire. Over 10 years together, Nutt fathered 3 children with Kimberly and subjected her to persistent abuse throughout. He controlled her finances, isolated her from family and friends, and struck her on multiple occasions, at times in front of their children. In 2015, she told the court she had woken to find him sitting on top of her with his hands around her throat. Kimberly described him as a Jekyll and Hyde character, outwardly calm in certain company, but capable of serious violence in private, particularly towards women. Dawn's own daughter would later tell the jury in almost the same terms that Nutt did not like women, that he respected men more, and that he would never raise his voice to a man. Nutt and Dawn had been together since around 2018. Her daughter described the relationship as moving very, very quickly from the start and having spiraled rapidly. Neighbours on Shirley Grove noticed it early. One described Nutt as possessive and controlling towards Dawn, but notably calmer with others. Another heard regular arguing from inside the house. In August 2020, a neighbour named Malcolm Crawshaw heard screaming and let himself into the property. Nutt told him Dawn was having an asthma attack. Dawn told Mr. Crawshaw not to believe him, that he was lying, that he was trying to kill her. Nutt was arrested, charged, and sentenced for that assault. He served time in custody and on release returned to Shirley Grove. To Dawn, the two resumed the relationship and began planning a wedding. In the months before the wedding, Dawn contacted Kimberly Alcock to ask why she had a restraining order against Nutt. Dawn told her that he scared the hell out of her. Kimberly advised her to look into his record through Clare's Law, the official disclosure scheme that allows people to request information about a partner's history of domestic abuse. In the days before the wedding, Dawn also reached out to a neighbour and asked whether she should, in her own words, get the hell out and run. In the final week before the 27th of October, she told her daughter she had a bad feeling she could not explain. She married him anyway. Escalation. The relationship between Dawn Walker and Thomas Nutt had never been stable, but in the period leading up to their wedding, several things are worth examining carefully, because together they reveal not just a volatile relationship, but a pattern of escalating control that had been building for years. The first thread is the assault of August 2020. This was not a minor incident. Dawn was left with a badly bruised face, cuts to her lips and cheeks, and bruising across her body. A neighbour who saw her described her as having been in a mess, with a massive black eye and heavily swollen features. In the aftermath, Dawn told Kimberly Alcock that Nutt had bruised her face and tried to suffocate her, that he had panicked when he saw the blood. She told Kimberly her face was a mess and described bruising to her stomach, arms and legs. She said Nutt had knelt on her. This was the man she would go on to marry 14 months later. The second thread is the pattern of isolation. Dawn's sister Lisa described, in her victim impact statement, how Nutt had spent 3 years progressively cutting Dawn off from the people who loved her. This is a documented and well-recognized feature of coercive relationships, the gradual narrowing of a person's world, so that over time, the abuser becomes the loudest and most constant voice in their life. By the time Dawn died, that process had, by her family's account, become nearly complete. The third thread is what Dawn herself said and did in the days before the wedding. She asked a neighbour whether she should run. She told her daughter she had a bad feeling. She had been warned by Nutt's former partner. She had been advised to look into his history. She knew more than enough about what he was capable of, and still she could not leave. This is the part of cases like Dawn's that is the hardest to sit with. but also the most important to understand. Leaving a relationship like the one Dawn was in is not simply a matter of deciding to go. By the time a person reaches the stage Dawn had reached, the mechanisms of control, the isolation, the fear, the financial dependency, the constant recalibration of what is normal have already done their work. Research on domestic abuse is consistent on this point. The period around a major life event, a wedding, a pregnancy, a separation, is frequently the point of highest risk. Dawn Walker married Thomas Nutt on the 27th of October 2021. She did not survive the night. The wedding reception at the Prince Albert pub in Brighouse ended, as wedding receptions do, and the couple returned home to Shirley Grove, Lightcliffe. What happened inside that house was later reconstructed by the court from forensic evidence, from Nutt's own account, and from the conclusions of His Honour Judge Jonathan Rose. Nutt claimed an argument broke out. He said Dawn became distressed, began screaming, and that he put his arm around her to restrain her. He said that within a few seconds, her body went limp and dropped out of his arms. The forensic evidence told a different story. A post-mortem found significant injuries to Dawn's neck, consistent with forceful and sustained pressure. The thyroid cartilage had been fractured. There was extensive bruising across her face, neck, chest, and collarbone, all inflicted before her death. Judge Rose concluded that Nutt had struck Dawn with considerable force and then applied deliberate, sustained pressure to her neck. It was not restraint. It was not an accident. Dawn Walker was killed in her own home on her wedding night by the man she had married that afternoon. What followed was methodical. Nutt placed Dawn's body inside a kitchen cupboard, where it would remain for several days. At 5:30 the following morning, a neighbour, Malcolm Crawshaw, encountered Nutt in the street. Nutt appeared startled. He handed Mr. Crawshaw a pair of earrings Dawn had borrowed from Mr. Crawshaw's wife for the wedding, and said she was inside, in bed. Later that day, he told another neighbour, Shane Barkham, that Dawn had a hangover and had asked to go to Skegness for a short break. In the days that followed, messages were sent to Dawn's daughter and to neighbours apparently from Dawn, explaining that she had lost her phone. Nutt then drove to the Skegness area alone, towing a caravan, spending several nights in a lay-by while sending further messages to maintain the story of a honeymoon in progress. He returned to Lightcliffe on Halloween. He put up garden decorations. He spoke to neighbours about the breakaway. Dawn's body was still in the cupboard. That afternoon, Nutt called 999 and reported his wife missing, saying she had failed to meet her daughter and had mental health problems. A police officer attended, spoke with Nutt, was shown around the house and left. Minutes after the officer's car had gone, Nutt took Dawn's body from the cupboard, forced it into a large suitcase, and wheeled it through the back garden to the fence line. CCTV captured him at the rear of the property. He threw the suitcase over the fence into undergrowth in the field beyond, then went back and covered the wheel tracks it had left in the soil. He then joined Dawn's daughter Kiera Lee and her baby grandson to look for his missing wife. They visited shops. They called hospitals. At one point, walking through a local cemetery with a neighbour, Nutt remarked that he was glad to have company because otherwise people might think he had killed his new bride. He had known exactly where she was the entire time. Forensic and investigative evidence. The case against Thomas Nutt rested on three mutually reinforcing categories of evidence, each one closing off a different line of defense. The first was the post-mortem. The pathologist's findings documented a fractured thyroid cartilage, bruising to the neck consistent with sustained manual pressure, and blunt force injuries to the face and body inflicted before death. These findings were incompatible with Nutt's account of a brief and unintended act of restraint. The post-mortem also identified fractures to both of Dawn's legs, confirmed to have been inflicted after death, consistent with the force required to fit her body into the suitcase in which she was later found. The second was CCTV. Footage from cameras around Shirley Grove captured Nutt moving the suitcase through the back garden on the afternoon of Halloween, within minutes of the attending police officer leaving the property. This placed him at the scene at the precise point the timeline demanded, and immediately after he had reported his wife missing. The footage of him returning to cover the wheel tracks in the garden soil was also recovered. Earlier CCTV from the Prince Albert established the last confirmed sighting of Dawn Walker alive as the evening of the 27th of October. Everything Nutt said about the days that followed was without evidential foundation. The third was witness testimony. Malcolm Crawshaw had intervened during the August 2020 assault and had heard Dawn say Nutt was trying to kill her. It was also neighbours, after Mr. Crawshaw shared his concerns, who ultimately directed police to the field where Dawn's body was found. Taken together, the pathology, the CCTV, and the witness accounts left no credible alternative explanation standing. Nutt had admitted killing Dawn from the outset, but claimed it was unintentional. The jury at Bradford Crown Court rejected that account after 11 days of evidence. Psychological analysis. What follows is grounded entirely in the documented facts, the pattern of behavior across multiple relationships, and the framework used in research on domestic abuse and domestic homicide. The first point is that Nutt's violence was not new, and it was not specific to Dawn Walker. Kimberly Alcock described 10 years of persistent abuse, physical attacks, financial control, isolation from family. She told the court she had known, for a long time, that he would one day kill someone. That observation matters, because it removes any explanation that depends on a particular relationship or a single provocation. The behavior was the constant, not the woman on the receiving end of it. The second point is the nature of what Nutt did after Dawn's death. The staged honeymoon, the messages, the missing person report, the cemetery walk, the Halloween decorations, the remark about needing company in case someone thought he had killed his bride. These are not the actions of a man in shock or overwhelmed by guilt. They are the actions of someone who had constructed a version of events and was performing it in real time. Researchers who study domestic homicide describe a recognizable disconnection between the severity of what has been done and the functional calm that follows. The ability to put up garden decorations while a loved one's body is inside the house represents a form of compartmentalization that is consistent with, and in many cases explains, the sustained coercive control that came before. The third point is the way Nutt framed Dawn throughout, both before and after her death. He described her to a police officer as a secret drinker. He told neighbors she had mental health problems. These were not casual remarks. They were a preemptive effort to characterize Dawn as unstable, so that her absence might appear self-generated and explicable. It was precisely the same mechanism he had used during the August 2020 assault, when he told a neighbor she was having an asthma attack. While she shouted from the landing that he was trying to kill her, Dawn spoke out. More than once, she told neighbors, she told her daughter, she told Kimberly Alcock. She asked a woman on her street whether she should run. None of it was enough to keep her safe. Most coverage of this case, understandably, focused on the most visible elements: the wedding, the suitcase, the the Halloween decorations, the cemetery walk. These details were striking, and they were real, and they rightly formed the core of the prosecution's narrative at Bradford Crown Court. But there is a question embedded in this case, one that deserves more sustained attention than it typically receives. In August 2020, Thomas Nutt was arrested, charged and sentenced for a violent assault on Dawn Walker, an assault serious enough that a neighbour heard it happening and intervened, serious enough that Dawn told that neighbour, in the moment, that Nutt was trying to kill her, serious enough that, in its aftermath, Dawn's face was so badly injured that a neighbour described her as having been in a mess, with a massive black eye and heavily swollen features. Nutt went to prison for that offence. And when he was released, he went home, to Dawn, and within 14 months, she was dead. The question this raises is not one of individual blame. It is a structural one. At what point, and in what way, do the systems that are supposed to protect people in Dawn's position make it genuinely harder for an abuser to return? What support was in place for Dawn during that 14-month period between the assault and the wedding? Who was checking? And when Dawn walked into Brighouse Register Office on the morning of the 27th of October, was anyone, in any official capacity, paying attention to what was happening? Kimberly Alcock had tried to warn Dawn. A neighbour had tried to warn Dawn. Dawn had tried to warn herself, reaching out to Nutt's former partner, contacting a friend, asking a woman on her street what she should do. The warnings were there. The concern was there. What was missing, in the gap between an assault conviction and a wedding certificate, was a mechanism capable of translating that concern into protection. Detective Inspector Amanda Wimbles of West Yorkshire Police, who led the investigation, said publicly after sentencing that she would encourage any victim of domestic abuse or coercive and controlling behaviour to come forward and report it to a specialist safeguarding officer. That message is important. But Dawn had already reported it. She had already been through the courts. She had already watched Nutt go to prison and come back. The system had an opportunity, and it was not enough. This is the conversation that cases like Dawn's should be forcing, not just in courtrooms, but in the committees and departments and policy discussions where decisions about resource, about intervention, about what happens to a convicted abuser and a known victim in the 14 months after sentencing are actually made. On the 19th of August 2022, Thomas Nutt was sentenced at Bradford Crown Court. His Honour Judge Jonathan Rose addressed him directly before reading the sentence, telling him that the court was sure he had killed Dawn Walker on their wedding night and that he had done so deliberately and with significant force. The judge described his behaviour in the hours and days that followed as calculated and sustained. He noted that Nutt had desecrated Dawn's body. He said the impact of her sudden and violent death at a time that should have been filled with happiness would affect everyone who had known her for the rest of their lives. Nutt was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years to be served before he can be considered for release by the parole board. A woman in the public gallery called out as the sentence was read, "Thank you, Your Honour. Thank you." In her victim impact statement, Dawn's sister Lisa Walker told the court that Nutt had manipulated and isolated Dawn from her family for 3 years. Before, in her words, his ungodly hands took her away from us forever. She said she mourned not just for her sister, but for the version of her sister's life that had been possible before Thomas Nutt entered it. Dawn's daughter, Kiera Lee, spoke of a mother who had felt something was wrong in the week before her wedding, and who had nevertheless gone ahead, because by that point, the choices available to her had been so narrowed by fear and control that leaving did not feel possible. She said, "Justice will be served for my beautiful mother." Kimberly Alcock, who had spent a decade living with the same man, had tried everything she could to help Dawn escape the same fate. After sentencing, she gave a short statement to the press. She said she thought he hated women. She said she did not know what had happened to him to make him that way, but she believed it was real and lasting. She said, "It is not that Dawn did not want to leave, it is that she could not." Detective Inspector Amanda Wimbles, the senior investigating officer who led the West Yorkshire police inquiry, said after the verdict that no sentence could bring Dawn back, but she hoped justice would allow the family to begin, in some small way, to move forward. Dawn Walker was 52 years old. She was a mother, a grandmother, a neighbor, a friend. She was described by the people who knew her as chirpy, warm, and full of life. She had children who needed her, grandchildren who will grow up without her, and a sister who will carry the shape of her absence for the rest of her life. She married Thomas Nutt on a Wednesday afternoon in October, surrounded by the people she loved. She did not come home from her wedding night. If this case raises questions for you about relationships, warning signs, or how to find help, organizations including Women's Aid and the National Domestic Abuse Helpline offer confidential support around the clock. Links are in the description below. If you found this video useful, please consider subscribing to follow future cases, and to help this channel continue telling stories like Dawn's with the accuracy and care they deserve. If this case stayed with you, please subscribe. It helps us keep covering stories like this with the care they deserve. Leave a case suggestion in the comments. We read everyone. Thank you for watching.